Welcome to Affinity's Industry Roundtable, combating AMR, identifying, predicting, and reducing global burden. Before we get started, there are a few brief housekeeping points. This session will be recorded and will be sent to you afterwards. We'll be presenting some exclusive insights and forecasts during this session. So if you'd like to receive more details on the analysis, for example, on our methodology, please reach out to the team afterwards. And we'll be taking questions from the audience and answering them live towards the end of the session. So feel free to drop the questions in the box throughout, and we'll make every effort to address them all. If we do run out of time and are unable to address your question, we'll follow up with you directly after the webinar. So while many of you may be aware of who Affinity are, I wanted to start with a very brief introduction about who we are. So Affinity is a disease forecasting company. We track, simulate, and predict population-level disease outcomes in real time to inform decisions that increase the global lifespan. Founded in 2015, Affinity uses unique quant analytics approach combined with advanced science, statistics, epidemiology, and machine learning solutions to dynamically understand true disease prevalence and underlying outcome drivers. I'm Matt Linley. I'm Senior Director of Analysis and Forecasting here at Affinity, and I'll be your host for today. I lead a multidisciplinary team responsible for our forecasting and predictive models. I've worked with key stakeholders from governments, pharma and biotech companies, as well as NGOs, and I've supported them with a range of disease models. And with me today, I have Tom Maguire, Senior Analyst and Medical Countermeasures Team Lead at Affinity. He has a particular focus in antimicrobial resistance, neglected tropical diseases, and antiviral development for pathogens of pandemic potential. Tom was previously a research associate in infectious diseases at King's College London, and with his project involving isolation of monoclonal antibodies for COVID-19 and HIV, and investigating the immune response to vaccines and infection. So why are we here today? Antimicrobial resistance is a threat that we're all aware of, and one that involves all corners of the life science sector, from pharmaceutical developers to public health providers and healthcare authorities. Greater collaboration is necessary for us to create unified priorities to tackle the increased burden of AMR. So now I'm very happy to welcome our panel. Firstly, we have Damiano De Felice, a non-profit executive with extensive experience in areas of global health, human rights, and sustainable investing. Currently Director of Development and External Engagement at Carbex, Damiano previously served as Director of Strategy at the Access to Medicine Foundation and has served on multiple expert and advisory groups, including the World Economic Forum, Global Future Council on Antimicrobial Resistance. Throughout his career, Damiano has advised international organizations, companies, governments, and NGOs, including the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights and the Italian Ministry of Economic Development. Next on our panel, we have Monica Schneider, the Director of Global Antimicrobial Resistance Policy at Shionogi, leading a global infectious disease policy initiatives and access projects. Before joining Shionogi, Monica was a managing associate at the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, where her work focused on incentive mechanisms and payment reform models to encourage development in areas of unmet medical need. Prior to that, she was the science policy analyst at the American Association of Immunologists, working on policies affecting the biomedical research community. Sarah McClelland is our third panelist, a health policy analyst supporting the Presidential Advisory Council on combating antimicrobial resistant bacteria. Sarah supports the development of all council products, including their most recent recommendation report, preparing for the next pandemic in the era of antimicrobial resistance from March 2023. Her other federal activities include coordinating with the Interagency CARB Task Force under the Assistant Secretary for Program and Evaluation at the Department of Health and Human Services. And finally, we'd like to welcome Lucas Ropp, Associate Director at the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations, also known as IFPMA. Luca works across industry and the wider global health community on solutions to tackle antimicrobial resistance, managing the IFPMA's policy and advocacy work on AMR, including related cross-functional area of vaccines for AMR. Previously, Luca worked in the AMR Industry Alliance Secretariat, including as interim secretariat lead. Before we get stuck into our discussion, I'd like to pass over to Tom, who has some exclusive analyses to share with you, providing insight into the current AMR landscape. So over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Matt. So yeah, I'll just give a quick overview of the area itself and some modelling work that we've done for some of the critical priority bacteria in the UK in particular. So just to give a brief overview of the actual mechanisms involved in antimicrobial resistance. So treatments are susceptible to either intrinsic or acquired mechanisms of resistance. So intrinsic being where bacterial species are naturally resistant to certain antibiotics, for example, Klebsiella being naturally resistant to ampicillin, E. coli being naturally resistant to macrolide antibiotics. But when it comes to antibiotic consumption, acquired resistance, where bacteria develop resistance over time due to exposure, is key, with most current classes of antibiotics affected by some form of acquired resistance. Now, studies have shown that resistance can start to develop as soon as 2 years after antibiotic approval, highlighting the need for careful use of current antibiotics and further development of novel innovative approaches, given how strongly some of these antibiotics are affected by acquired mechanisms, such as drug target modification and active drug efflux. So why is this important? So according to the Global Burden of Disease study data published in The Lancet, there were approximately 1.27 million deaths directly attributable to antimicrobial resistance in the year of 2019. With the critical priority bacteria, according to the WHO list, so E. coli, Klebsiella pneumoniae, Acinetobacter baumannii, and Pseudomonas aeruginosa, accounting for the large majority of these deaths. Now, aside from mortality, AMR could result in at least $3.4 trillion in annual economic damage by 2030, pushing around 24 million more people into extreme poverty, and an estimated 10 million resistance-related deaths going out to 2050, matching current global cancer-related mortality. So, as I mentioned, antibiotic consumption can be quite a key driver of antimicrobial resistance, with a key example recently being the Mycoplasma pneumoniae outbreak in China, signifying the impact of long-term inappropriate use, potentially driving resistance and associated burden. So, as you can see, the proportion of macrolide-resistant Mycoplasma pneumoniae infections per year in each WHO region is largely driven by the Western Pacific, with around 80% resistance shown to macrolides in Mycoplasma pneumoniae isolates up to around 2020. This has driven some increased outbreaks, particularly in key populations like pediatrics, where macrolides are the only appropriate used antibiotic for pediatric patients, leaving some patients completely susceptible to these infections, and thereby driving the increased waves of Mycoplasma pneumonia infections that we've recently seen, for example, in China. So this can also happen over quite a short term. So it's been shown through data from the CDC that elevated use of antibiotics during the COVID-19 pandemic may have actually contributed to antimicrobial resistant infections and deaths. So as you can see on the graph at the right, when you look at the number of COVID-19 inpatients with treated with an antibiotic, approaching around 72.48% in North America, compared to the number of patients with bacterial co-infection, as low as 8% in North America and even lower in Europe and Asia, showing that many of these COVID-19 patients may have been inappropriately treated with an antibiotic when there will obviously be no response due to the viral infection. And when you look at some of the key bacterial infections, for example, carbapenem-resistant Acinetobacter, multi-drug-resistant Pseudomonas aeruginosa in 2019 compared to 2020, you see up to around a 40% increase in carbapenem-resistant Acinetobacter, potentially being driven by this short-term inappropriate use. It should be said it's unclear to what extent this has actually been caused by resistance, but there is quite a strong positive correlation here. And when you look at some of the data, raw data for multiple antibiotics in the UK, it does appear that resistance levels can correlate with consumption, again, both short-term and long-term. So we wanted to look at this in a bit more detail and see if we could model resistance to key antibiotics for the WHO priority bacteria. As I mentioned, that means Klebsiella pneumoniae, E. coli, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and Acinetobacter baumannii, using historical infection rates, resistance rates, and antibiotic consumption under 3 separate scenarios. The first assumes a continuation of current antibiotic consumption trends. A high consumption scenario assumes around a 10% year-on-year increase in consumption. And third, a low consumption scenario, assuming a 10% year-on-year decrease. So when you look at the scenarios for some of these bacteria, should just note that we've used the UK as data are very robust and trends are quite comparable between the UK and some other high-income nations in Europe and North America. And to highlight that even a high-income nation with quite strong policy incentives and antimicrobial stewardship with relatively low levels of inappropriate use, such as the UK, even minor changes in consumption could lead to quite a significant shift in resistance. It's also worth noting here that the historical data used to train these models also includes data from 2020, during which usage of some antibiotics actually decreased quite significantly, particularly those used in outpatient and community settings. But even taking this into account, we still see some potentially significant increases in resistance to these antibiotics, even without any major increases in usage. It's also key to highlight again that compared to some other countries, the UK has done relatively well in terms of reducing inappropriate consumption. The same, unfortunately, can't be said for several low and middle income countries, for which the current trends are still likely to see quite large increases in resistance. Just give a very quick overview of the models. This is based on the observed relationship, as I mentioned, between antibiotic consumption and rates of resistance, but doesn't factor in any nonlinear relationships between these variables at this stage, and relies on the historical resistance and infection data, which in some cases might not be complete. Some cases may go undiagnosed. And in terms of infection rates, this assumes consistent trends in infection rates and antibiotic consumption in the current trends as well. And should highlight that this only applies to the specific drug-bug combination being mentioned and doesn't account for any implementation of any AMR-focused healthcare policies or stewardship initiatives. So as a key example, ciprofloxacin is on the WHO essential medicines list and is one of the most prescribed broad-spectrum antibiotics according to the CDC. So it's imperative that resistance to this remains low. In the current scenario, you still see a steady increase in resistance, but when you increase consumption even by as little as 10%, you do see quite significant changes year on year. So even approaching up to 60% in Klebsiella pneumoniae by 2033, with quite a significant change in a decreased consumption scenario, highlighting how much this consumption is driving resistance in some of these key bacteria. Another example in Klebsiella, so third-gen cephalosporin, resistance at present, as I mentioned, because the UK is doing quite well at preventing inappropriate use. Based on the current trends, this is actually set to decrease. But again, just highlighting any small changes in consumption can have quite significant increases in resistance. Again, with resistance potentially increasing based on the high consumption scenario, up to 60% by 2033. This trend is also repeated. We haven't shown the data here, but also repeated for gentamicin and carbapenems, although with overall lower rates of resistance. In E. coli, so a particular example of piperacillin tazobactam, quite often used in severe E. coli infections. This resistance could reach around 20% in the UK by 2033. And again, third-gen cephalosporin rates in E. coli also showing resistance up to a similar level. Acinetobacter baumannii, our modeling shows again to piperacillin tazobactam, a common first-line antibiotic, could reach around 25% based on the high consumption scenario, with based on current trends still increasing to over 15%. I've also seen this similar trend to ciprofloxacin in Acinetobacter baumannii, with resistance going above 30% in an increased usage scenario. We've also, as I mentioned, done this for gentamicin as well, with resistance in Acinetobacter baumannii reaching up to 70% by 2033. And finally, we have an example for Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So again, using ciprofloxacin, so resistance remaining relatively stable, even decreasing slightly based on the current trends. Again, should highlight that this is still taking into account some of the 2020 data, but just highlighting the significant changes that could happen with even slightly increased consumption in Pseudomonas. So this is a small selection of our AMR work. We're also performing similar analyses for the WHO high priority bacteria and in other nations and to other antibiotics, particularly in the US. So as Matt mentioned, please do get in touch if you'd be interested in seeing any of this, or if there are any other further analysis you'd like us to perform based on what you've seen today, or if there's any more information on the modeling used, then please do let us know. So on that note, I'll hand back over to Matt and the panel to go over some of the methods for avoiding these sorts of scenarios.
Thank you, Tom, for that great analysis. And as we can see, even minimal and short-term increases in inappropriate antibiotic consumption could be devastating for us, with resistance levels expecting to rise further potentially. So this brings us very nicely to our main focus of today's session, our panel discussion. I'd like to remind you of our 4 experts we have with us today. Damiano De Felice, Director of Development and External Engagement at Carbex. Monica Schneider, Director of Global Antibiotic Resistance Policy at Shionogi. Sarah McClelland, Health Policy Analyst at the Presidential Advisory Council on Combating Antibiotic-Resistant Bacteria, and Lucas Rock, the Associate Director of Health Security at IFPMA. So I welcome you to please submit any questions you have for our panel in the Q&A function. I'll start by kicking things off with a first question. So firstly, what are the current challenges to antibiotic development regarding increased resistance, and what are the potential solutions for them? So I'll put that first question to you, Luca.
Thanks, Matt, and it's great to be here and have this discussion. Thank you also for the presentation, which I felt was really interesting, and I think there's a number of takeaways that could be taken up from there, and keen to kind of think about that a bit more as well. But I think so. The question that you're asking, it's a very good question, a very important question, and a question that probably has a very broad answer behind it, and we could probably spend the whole of the next 40 minutes talking about these challenges, right? But I think in brief terms, so the challenges certainly here are multifaceted when we talk about antibiotic development, right? And this has been evidenced not only by the limited number of approvals in the last years. If we look at, for example, the direct-acting small molecule antibiotics, there have been only a handful, and only 2 of which have been deemed innovative by WHO criteria. But there's also this other aspect, which is the overall waning of the clinical pipeline, right? And we have now, across phase 2 and phase 3, only, I believe, 10 antibiotics, again, small molecule direct-acting antibiotics against WHO priority pathogens in development. So the clinical pipeline is weak, and what can we now do about that, right? The preclinical pipeline, which is comparatively, somewhat better, more diverse, with I think over 200 assets in development, in no small part thanks to existing push funding like BARDA and Carbex, has been crucial overall, and that needs to be maintained, right? But we also need to think about where are the challenges later on in development, and what new mechanisms we think are needed that encourage investment into these later, more expensive stages of development. Crucially, there also seems to be an indication that clinical assets in the later stages of development are not progressing through clinical trial phases, despite the fact that they potentially show positive data in clinical trials, including in phase 3 clinical trials, right, implicating a lack of funding in that respect. Moreover, even if you get through this, what is often deemed valley of death, so, the high risk, expensive clinical trials, and you make it to market, that still doesn't guarantee success, right? We have examples of companies in the last years, especially smaller companies that have been successful in their efforts, have launched an antibiotic, but still faced significant challenges. They, went bankrupt, had to be sold off. They had to restructure or something similar because they simply could not recoup their investment, which makes sense if you think about the fact that, as you just showed, antibiotic use in itself, whether it's appropriate or not, is certainly in itself a driver of resistance. That's just an evolutionary fact. So obviously, new antibiotics to get developed need to be used sparingly and only when they're absolutely necessary, right? The potential solutions here that have been discussed now quite often in the last couple of years, include sort of new pull incentives that can, make this investment proposition and the return on investment after launch much more attractive and much better, and thus bring back the investment into the space. This is something that the world is really mostly looking towards the countries, the high-income countries, G7 and the EU, which, there's been some progress in this area. Certainly, I think we, need to recognize the discussions that are taking place and the progress that's been achieved, and implementing models that on this sort of, volume de-linked basis rewards investment and basically, involves what is often been called the Netflix model. Basically, there's a fixed fee for new antibiotic paid that is agreed between the developer and the payer or the country in question. So those solutions, are going to be, I think, the most impactful. And action on this does need to be stepped up. Again, we should recognize here the progress achieved, for example, by the UK, which now has firm plans to implement a permanent pull incentive this year. Similar discussions happening also in the US with the Draft Pasteur Act, which, if passed, would be significantly impactful and be a very powerful contribution to solving this issue. And then the rest of the countries, Canada, Japan, and the other G7 countries in the EU, also there's discussions happening there. And I think there's broad recognition on the models that could work here, right? There's a proposal being discussed in Canada, for example, that could play this role, be Canada's contribution to the effort. Japan has taken the first steps on this with their revenue guarantee pilot, which, although seems at this point to be geared more towards enabling access, if expanded, could really act as a pull incentive and join the ranks of others, right? So all that to say that the solutions that that would work to fix the broken market and then bring the investment back into this field are in some cases already happening, and the implementation is underway. And also encouraging, I think, is the fact that now these discussions are at least progressing in more G7 countries than not, right? So we do need to stress the urgency of moving forward on this towards implementation. And I'm hopeful that we can see some significant progress on this this year, especially given that we have the high-level meeting also later in the year, which hopefully will add some important momentum to these discussions.
Yeah, thank you, Luca, for that very comprehensive answer. I was wondering, Damiano, if you had any additional thoughts there, particularly on the current challenges to the development of antibiotics and increased resistance.
So thank you for the invitation. I think Lucas was very comprehensive, so I don't think there is a lot to add. I think that if we want to summarize in a nutshell what the problem is that because of the challenges in terms of actually making money from new antibiotics when they reach the market, we have seen a lot of private capital leaving like the field of research and development. So we have like very few venture capital firms which are investing in small biotech companies developing new antibiotics, and we have seen many big pharmaceutical companies leaving the space for potential acquisitions, usually in clinical development. So we're very happy to have Shionogi here. They're one of the few, I I know probably, I know it's not big pharma, but let's say large enough pharmaceutical companies still making new investments in this field, showing how a true believer they are, I think, in the anti-infective space. But the challenge is that there is limited private capital, both from investors and big pharmaceutical companies. The solution has been fundamentally to, for the public and for philanthropists to step in to make like this space a healthier space. And this comes with two solutions, which are usually called like push and pull incentives. With the push incentives, fundamentally, governments and private foundations make the development of new antibiotics less expensive. So they tend to be grants, for example, to small biotech companies, so that a VC firm can invest half of the money that they should invest if there was no public funding. A pull incentive is what Luca described as fundamentally making the reward at the end of the process bigger. And so addressing the problem of the market being too small, making the market bigger by engineering some policy solutions that make sure that if you bring a new antibiotic to the market, you make enough money. We've had, I think, dozens and dozens of reports in the past 10 years about the importance of push and pull and how they are complementary. We do not see significant challenges from a scientific perspective in the sense that, or different challenges that in other therapeutic areas. We don't think that at the moment, developing a new antibiotic is inherently and scientifically more difficult than developing a new cancer medicine. The challenge is that there is no money. And so the solution needs to come with policy interventions to make sure that there is more private funding into this space. And this is what push and pull are trying to do.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think, of course, it's a tricky one to get right. On the kind of flip side of that, and this is a question more for Sarah, is should the world be adopting a One Health approach? And if so, what does that look like? So how important is prioritizing climate change to prevent increased AMR burden?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be included in a pretty development and drug development space as kind of the more public health and policy side. So I just wanted to thank you all for inviting me here. The short answer to your question is a big resounding yes. One Health, a One Health approach is really key to addressing drug resistance. And with that comes a lot of other implications, especially climate change. I wanted to quickly just reiterate a bit about the Lancet report that was mentioned earlier, giving kind of really stark numbers to the AMR burden we currently have going on, kind of where it could be in by 2050, and just reminding everyone that those numbers were pre-COVID-19, pre-pandemic. So as we know, this is a pretty dire situation. And I think what those numbers really underscore is the necessity to combat drug resistance through a really multidisciplinary and multifaceted approach. And where possible, adopting a One Health approach really allows for a more holistic and robust response to combating drug resistance, as it recognizes the connection between human health, animal health, plant health, and our shared environment. Excuse me, I'm getting over a bit of a cold, so please bear with me. But today, more practically, what we've seen is that use of antibiotics can and does drive resistance. And this is also true for antimicrobial use in animals as well, which can be alarming both from an animal welfare standpoint, but also from a zoonotic spillover standpoint as well. An example of this actually happened a few years ago. Our chair of our council, Paul Plummer's work on resistant Campylobacter in breeding kennels in the US was really instrumental in helping the CDC detect and trace a 2016 human outbreak of Campylobacter that was linked to pet store puppies. So that's just a real world example of kind of what One Health means, kind of, in our reality and in the field of drug resistance. But really turning back to the environment, and I want to focus a bit more on the environment just because I think traditionally it's been a little bit left out of the conversation of One Health. But antibiotics are used in agriculture, in crop crop farming, and that can contribute to resistant bacteria in soil and manure, which can eventually reach waterways and food sources. The release of pharmaceutical manufacturing byproducts and human and animal waste can also be a driver of AMR in the environment. Changes in the environment, such as the disruption of wildlife habitats, increasing that human-animal contact and zoonotic disease spillover, and even a lack of kind of wash infrastructure, that's water, sanitation and hygiene infrastructure and supplies, can increase environmental levels of AMR and thereby increase risk of acquiring a drug-resistant infection from the environment. While that has kind of been a well-known and established pathway, what we really have come to understand more recently, and especially through a more recent UNEP report, is the role of climate change in driving drug resistance, both directly and indirectly. Climate change alters the natural environment and creates more favorable conditions for AMR pathogens to develop and spread. Shifts in temperature and environmental conditions really exacerbate the spread of bacterial and fungal diseases, as well as viral, parasitic, vector-borne diseases among, humans, plants, and animals. Increased temperatures from climate change can result in increased bacterial growth rates, horizontal gene transfer and infection rates, and severe weather events, which are more frequent due to climate change, such as increased participation, can result in more flooding, spread of waterborne diseases due to overflowing of contaminated water from sewage lines, or contamination by livestock and wildlife. Also, kind of another impact of climate change is population displacement from natural disasters, and that can often lead to overcrowding conditions during relocation and rescue efforts. And those overcrowding conditions can increase infection rates and the spread of resistant diseases as well. Needless to say, I think that's a pretty long laundry list of a dire situation, but I wanted to quickly just give a bit of background about kind of PACARB and who we are and what we do. I know you gave a brief introduction, Matt, but we are a U.S. federal advisory council that provides advice and recommendations on all things related to drug resistance to the Secretary of Health and to the President. And we have actually employed a One Health perspective or One Health framework since our inception in 2015, which means we have subject matter expertise, federal and non-federal subject matter expertise across the One Health spectrum. So human health, animal health, and environmental health. And I can just say anecdotally, from 2015 to now, having all of those experts in the room in terms of policy making has been incredibly rewarding and eye-opening. There are similarities and connections across the domains that you wouldn't think of. And there's a lot of ways to be really creative in our policy solutions when you take a more holistic approach. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Matt. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that very comprehensive answer. And there was also a question in the chat around the use of antibiotic use in animal feed and that whether that contributes to AMR. So I think you've thoroughly covered that in your answer as well. So for the next question, I think there's a lot of pressure for the development of what is termed innovative antibiotics, for which there are quite a few different definitions, mostly focusing on the impact on resistance. So I think I'll throw this question to Monica. What are your thoughts on the innovative as a descriptor? Are we capturing the right things? How might our definition impact innovation in the space?
Sure, thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to participate in the panel and for these questions. Before I directly get to your question, let me just give a little brief introduction to Shionogi for those who may not be familiar. We are a 145-year-old company with headquarters in Osaka, Japan, and subsidiaries in the US and the EU. We've been very active in the infectious diseases space and have brought 7 antibiotics to the market over the past 70 years, as well as antiviral products for HIV, influenza, and COVID-19. So we do have a lot of thoughts on innovation and innovative antibiotics in particular. The defining innovation can be a bit tricky. I think there have been, it can refer to a lot of different things, either the mechanism of action for how bacteria are killed, whether it be a new class of drug, whether it can overcome resistance. And I would tend to say that a broader definition of innovation will bring us more products and bring perhaps more creativity to the field. Some definitions have been restricted to mechanism of action or to antibiotic class. But this might be a little too restrictive, as there can be innovation beyond just the mechanism of action. For example, products that can help restore the activity of an antibiotic that pathogens have become resistant to. And just thinking about how we can get better outcomes and bring more innovation to the field. I think looking at the Carbex pipeline and the number of innovative approaches and applications that Carbex has received, it does appear that innovation in the antimicrobial space has been increasing over the years. However, we are still lacking a predictable and consistent funding and predictable market for antimicrobial products. So there's nowhere for these products to have success if they do reach the market. So as was mentioned earlier by Luca and by Damiano, implementation of pull incentives at both the country and the regional levels can help to drive additional innovation. Pull incentives in particular offer predictable revenue, and when they're adequately funded and sustainably implemented or sustainably put in place, they can offer a significant reward for the innovation that might come to market. And then just one other note about who is driving the innovation. This is often done by scientists and researchers and are really dependent on people with the scientific expertise to think about new approaches and new mechanisms for combating antimicrobial resistant bacteria. But concerningly, a recent report from the AMR Industry Alliance has shown that the number of researchers in the antimicrobial field has been decreasing substantially over the past, I think, 20 years or so. And this has led to fewer publications in the AMR space, fewer patents for antimicrobial products, and ultimately less people who companies can rely on to do that research in innovation. So we really do need to bolster the investment in this space and make it an attractive place for people to do research. And so this could include pull incentives, which can keep those companies who hire these researchers in business in the long term.
Thank you. Yeah, that's I didn't realize that the number of researchers in the space was shrinking, and that's yeah, that's quite shocking to hear. And one of the next questions we have is around on the topic of innovation, how do we think we can speed up antibiotic development, which I think it sounds like, as you said, the number of publications and patents is slowing down. So this question is around what can be done to speed it up. I think there's been a lot around funding and investment in the space. So I think that's more or less being covered. So I'm wondering, are there anything else, other factors and things that can be done to speed up innovation in this space? And that's an open question to anyone who wants to jump in. Yeah, Luca, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Sorry, Matt. I'll be really brief, and give others a chance to chime in as well, because I think it's a really good question that will benefit from a lot of different perspectives. So I think in terms of speeding up, right? The fact of the matter is that if we look at the current ecosystem, right, with the waning clinical pipeline, and as Monica indicated, quite concerning numbers in terms of the researchers involved in this area, as well as scientific publications in this space, there is a bit of a downward trend across the spectrum, right? So I think the question on speeding up antibiotic development is certainly a very important one. We need to do that, right? The world urgently needs new antibiotics. But to be able to do that, first we have to, I think, consider how can we reverse this negative trend, because it's not really, going to reverse itself by itself. And a concern, I think, here is that, we often talk about the need for urgent new solutions to fix the broken market and bring back investment and bring researchers back into the space, right? And that is absolutely true. These measures are urgent. The problem, though, is that unless prompt action is taken very soon, the ecosystem, both in terms of the assets in development and the researchers involved, might get to a sort of irreversible stage where no amount of new incentives will be able to give us new antibiotics, because there will simply be no one else involved in the space, or just being unable to respond, I think, to the need, right? And hence also, just to kind of quickly go back to the comment that was also made by Monica in terms of how do we define innovation, and what do we how do we take that into account when implementing these measures? There's been some good progress, I think, recently under the NHS subscription model, for example, right? Kind of expanding from the product-centric criteria also into areas such as relative effectiveness and unmet clinical needs, pharmacological benefit, health system benefit, right? And I think this, again, just to reiterate the importance of having that comprehensive look at the benefit of new antibiotics, and to then appropriately take that into account when we think about how to encourage this innovation, right? Which, again, I think is an urgent matter.
Thank you.
So I will give an answer which is different than funding and different than money. I will go back to the money, because I think it's still, in many cases, 80% of the problem. So there is a regulatory element related to the development of new antibiotics, which is important, which is an ongoing conversations, I think, with regulatory agencies around the world in terms of how to bring new antibiotics to the market with the right packs of data that fundamentally shows to doctors the fact that these new antibiotics are important and valuable, and they address unmet medical needs. Because antibiotics are miracle medicines that save your lives from infections that may kill you like in 1 week, there are a lot of challenges in running superiority trials, for example, for new antibiotics, where fundamentally you show that the new antibiotics works better than the existing treatment for specific cases of resistant infections. And just to mention one example of these challenges is the fact is that even if you have a diagnostic that tells you that you have a new patient that comes and may be part of the trial, and they do have a drug-resistant infections, for ethical reasons, you cannot actually allocate them and randomize them within the trial, because fundamentally you're just killing them if you put them like in the wrong arm of the trial. So this is on antibiotics. Also, there was a question, I think, in the chat on non-traditional approaches. In Monica mentioned the fact that there is a lot of innovation. Innovation is alive as well in preclinical development, and a lot of it is not only on antibiotics. We have bacteriophages, microbiome-based approach, peptides, very different types of products. The challenge with these products is that they've never been approved for any indication and any therapeutic area. So there is a lot of conversation about how regulatory agencies will actually look at the development of these new products, because these will be the first time ever that they've been approved potentially. And so there is a lot that can be done on the regulatory side as well to make sure that we speed up the process of developing new products to address AMR with the right packets of data that can be helpful for doctors and physicians to use these medicines at their best.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think there was questions around as well in the chat around the development of vaccines as well. Do you have anything to comment on the development of vaccines in this space as well? Anyone? Let me know.
We do. So CARB-X is a public-private partnership that accelerates the early stage development of products to address AMR. We do cover vaccines as well. So we cover products to treat, prevent, and diagnose drug-resistant infections. I put a link in the chat about like a couple of good reports that fundamentally look at different types of pathogens and infections and which vaccines can be possible and in which time frame and with what scientific challenges for the future. For vaccines as well, there is a funding challenge, and the phase 2, phase 3 of vaccines are also very expensive. And so as we focus mainly on the early stages of development, we're really thinking a little bit more about like what are the potential downstream funding opportunities for some vaccines when they reach like phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. But vaccines can play a very important role to address AMR, even for infections which are not drug resistant, because we use a lot of antibiotics for infections which are not even bacterial infections, and so there are a lot of positive externalities with recurring to vaccines. So definitely one of the tools that we need to explore as we see challenges on traditional antibiotics.
Thank you. And then the next question I have is, do we think there's sufficient awareness amongst the public over the extent of the problem? And a follow-up to that is, how can the life science sector better educate and work with the public on this? So I might send that question to Sarah initially.
Sure. Thank you for the question. Yeah, there is probably not sufficient awareness amongst the general public. I think there's definitely growing awareness, but especially given some of the challenges we saw starting with the COVID-19 pandemic, education and scientific communication really needs greater attention. PACCARB really tried to address some of this in our most recent report, which hopefully will be linked to all, but can also be found on our website. The report's title is Preparing for the Next Pandemic in the Era of Antimicrobial Resistance. And in this report, PACCARB provided a recommendation on the importance of health communication prior to and during an emergency. And a key facet of those recommendations was also prioritizing marginalized communities and voices in all communication strategies and outreach. And I think while those recommendations were specific towards kind of preparing for our next potential pandemic, those lessons can really be extrapolated much further in kind of our broader discussion on awareness of drug resistance. And I think including those marginalized communities and voices is also something that remains hugely important, whether we're looking domestically or globally, and especially in our work with LMICs. And I think another really important key thing that PACCARB has recommended and kind of looked at very closely through our past reports is the fact that behavior science is a really key part of this as well. And so it's really important to include foundations of kind of behavior change and behavior science, as well as a really well thought out communication strategy. Those should really be fundamental pieces of all interventions. And whenever the council kind of approaches the topic, especially of kind of drug development, they also include a lot of recommendations about stewardship, which I think has been brought up here today several times as well. And I think a key part of being proper stewards for current and any new drugs is really understanding how and when to use them appropriately, and having that kind of communication and behavior change foundation in all of our interventions really can help further that goal. And I think that kind of tying it back to the One Health nature is also really important as well, and including that in our communication strategies.
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess on the point of communication and kind of the second part of the question I had there around can the life science sector better educate and work with the public? So Monica, I don't know if you have some thoughts on that.
Sure, thank you. And I would largely agree with what Sarah said. Public awareness of the issue of AMR is really lacking. I think this is because it's a difficult topic. The science is really challenging, and the potential solutions can be pretty complex. And I think on top of that, antimicrobial infections often occur in parallel to other disease conditions. So even if a patient has a resistant infection, or if ultimately there's mortality as a result of infection, it's not necessarily labeled as such. And so patients and their families might not even be aware that they've been impacted by resistance. And I think that we as a community need to keep doing work to provide additional education and making the topic more accessible. one thing is there are a couple of papers recently showing that AMR is not even a good term to be using to describe the problem because it's not memorable, and AMR really doesn't mean anything to anyone who's not in the field. So I think we have a lot of work to do on improving how we communicate the issues. But one area where we have been somewhat successful and where I think it's very impactful is hearing patient stories and having patients who have been impacted by resistance share their experiences, and I think the public can really learn and understand better when it comes from individuals who have gone through these infections and had these experiences. And I'll note that one really great example of sharing patient stories is a recent BBC StoryWorks film, which Shinogi and other companies supported the production of. It's called Race Against Resistance. And this film shares the journeys of several patients and talks about how antimicrobial resistance has impacted them in their lives, as well as providing some hopeful solutions and paths forward for addressing antimicrobial resistance in the future.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. And Damiano,
yeah, if I may, I also find it important to mention that for many years we also lacked the data to show the problem I think that we have with funding and with for innovative products. I strongly and this data is fundamentally to educate politicians and the general people about what we're facing in the innovation space for antimicrobials. So I strongly encourage the audience. There are so if you're interested in looking more at the public side of funding for antimicrobial research and development, there is an organization based in Berlin which is called the Global AMR R&D Hub, which has a lot of data about like where public sources of funding are for AMR R&D. And if you're more interested on the private side, Bio, so the industry association of the smaller biotech companies in the US have I think now an annual or biannual report that looks at the state of innovation in antibacterial treatment. So these are very important to show politicians that progress can be made, and we see that politicians and policymakers are responding. Even outside of the G7, I'm happy to mention that, for example, even in Switzerland, which is a country obviously with a lot of pharmaceutical companies, there is now a proposal for a revision of their epidemics law that could lead to the implementation of new push and pull incentives in Switzerland. So I think we're making progress. Data is fundamental, and making sure that this data is conveyed to policymakers also is key.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So we've got about 5 minutes left. So I've got a final question for our panelists. So with the UN General Assembly in September, what do you want to see happen before then? How can we avoid further situations like the Mycoplasma outbreak in China across the globe? So this is a question to all of the panelists. So yeah, if with the 5 minutes left, if you can take maybe about 1 minute to tell me, what you would like to see kind of before the UN General Assembly in September. So I'll start with Luca.
Thanks, Matt. Really quickly, I think, just trying to think about this in the context of, the previous high-level meeting, in fact, which was 8 years ago, right? And I think, it did a lot to raise awareness on the issue and work, towards education. We've seen a lot of great new initiatives born out of that. You have CARB-X, you have CARB-P, you have the AMR Industry Alliance on the industry side. Later on, also the AMR Action Fund. I think we really should collectively think ambitiously about the high-level meeting itself. There's great opportunity now to think about concrete next steps. Concrete commitments and targets to work towards and to work those out between stakeholders and for the countries to take forward. So in terms of what would be great to see until then is just really these impactful and productive discussions actually that will get us to a point by September that there's a clear set of robust targets or other commitments that the broader stakeholder space will support.
Thank you. And Monica?
Sure, thanks. So I think many of the challenges that we're currently facing with innovation, with ensuring appropriate access, are due to a broken and unsustainable market for antimicrobials. So what I'd like to see is that the UN and its membership really focus on transforming the antimicrobial ecosystem, and in particular ensuring that there's a functional and sustainable market, which may be through implementing and funding new pull incentives or other types of new incentives that encourage companies, investors, and researchers to continue pursuing antimicrobial innovation.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll go to Damiano.
Sorry. It's a very short amount of time, another time until September, but I think that an important hope that we have is that the political declaration coming out from the high-level meeting will recognize the need for additional evidence about a lot of things related to antibacterial resistance and antimicrobial resistance in general. So there is a proposal on the table for an independent body, an independent panel that would create and monitor evidence for action on AMR. This is similar to what we have on climate change, where we have the IPCC. So we hope, we think that would represent a strong foundation for progress in the coming years, even beyond September 2024.
Thank you very much. And some final words from Sarah.
Great, thank you. I would just reiterate what all the other panelists have said as well. I think those are really great aspirational things that we hope will come out of the high-level meeting in September. I would just add, on that kind of One Health train, I think a more thoughtful inclusion of the environment in our discussion about AMR at a high-level meeting would be really impactful and powerful to see, as well as recognition that, building off the progress of the last meeting in 2016, I believe it was, no one size fits all for countries facing drug resistance. And so really kind of prioritizing, trying to meet countries where they're at in their fight against AMR would be also a great priority to see come out of this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We also had some questions in the chat, which I think most of those have been answered in our discussions, and then thank you to the panelists who also answered them directly in the chat. There are a number of useful links also posted there, so we'll make sure that those get sent out afterwards. So that brings us to the end of our session. I'd like to once again thank our fantastic panelists, Damiano De Felice, Monica Schneider, Sarah McClelland, and Lucas Rock for their time today and for providing us with really valuable insights on the challenges and priorities around antimicrobial resistance. We'll leave it there, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining.